All right, hello everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Kevin Navratil. I'm the Democracy Commitment Coordinator at Moraine Valley. And what we like to do is have events on campus to try to promote civic learning, current events, things that are happening, elections, and sometimes trends that are really impactful in our politics in America. And one of those trends that Professor Jason King and I have been talking about for a while is the kind of sorting and the red versus blue states, and within states, how you see huge divisions of how people vote based on where they live. And I think Professor King's going to show that that's not specific to the United States, that this is a global phenomenon, and it's been one that's years in the making. So I thank you all for being here. I really want to thank Jason King, geography professor, sometimes math professor, teaches a lot of different classes at Moraine. Thank you for sharing your expertise and insights on the red and blue in geography. So with that, I'll turn it over to Professor King.
Is it on now? There we go. Hello, Moraine Valley. Good to see everybody. Let's jump right into it because I have 155 slides of geographic goodness. We should have time at the end, though, so that should not be an issue. This is kind of the menu of what we're talking about today. Introduction, 2015, and the year everything started to change. Any of my students that are looking for a good book to read still for their book report, or anybody that's just looking for a really interesting book, one of my favorite geography professors that writes is named Tim Marshall. And he wrote this really great book called The Age of Walls. And I'm a little bit old, and I remember growing up in the 80s that the world looked phenomenally different than it does today. The world was significantly less free than it is today. The world was significantly less open. The world was significantly less connected than it is today. This is a map that's imperfect because it shows the US and the Soviet Union in essentially the same spot. We have an indirect form of governing with our head of state, but that's of course because we have, we don't vote for the president directly. We vote for typically people that elect that person. Compare and contrast with 2024. And we can see that the world is significantly more free today. For a long time, the thought was that this process was going to continue, that the world was going to become more democratic, more free, more open, more liberal with a lowercase l, meaning classically liberal, meaning freer markets, freer people. But then things started to change. Well, more about that. You can see the things that people were thinking about in the 90s and the early aughts, that the world was clearly becoming a freer place, a safer place, in many ways a better place. In a lot of ways, this was beneficial for everyone. This quote, where goods don't cross borders, armies will. If my students remember when we did the trade discussion, we talked about the idea that when you trade, by definition, you're doing so because things are going to improve, unless if it's because of coercion or imperfect information. But what started to happen in the 2010s was people began to move, and people are not goods. Things really began to change in 2008. This long trend where global trade was continuing to increase began to hit a kink in the road, and it began to flatten out. Our world didn't become more globalized as it had been before 2008. It began to become more autarkic, less free, less trading orientated. And we began to think about globalization as far as the ending of globalization, a term that I hadn't heard until the last couple of years, deglobalization, when our world became less global, less free. Really, this changed significantly in 2015. 2015, if there was a year that the walls really went up, it was probably then. A number of things that happened in accordance probably happened. The first was the Russian invasion of Crimea. So this happened in 2014. In case you don't read Russian, this says Crimea, Krim Russia. Crimea is Russia. And this was a general sentiment in Russia and even among people living in Crimea. Crimea is one of these spots that's difficult to talk about as far as fitting into the global worldview because people in Crimea generally wanted to be Russian. But another was the large migration of Syrians leaving due to the Syrian civil war. Syrians that were leaving the Syrian civil war, some of whom are returning now that the civil war is over, went all over the Middle East, went all over the Near East, went into Central Asia. Many went into Europe, where European countries began to question how much immigration they were able to have. And closer to home, there was also the decoupling of Venezuela from the global market, where Venezuela, if you recall a couple of weeks ago when we talked, had a significant out-migration that was spread all through Central America, South America, and even into the United States. At first, this was seen as being something that wasn't going to have many effects, but it did. The first one was in 2016 when the United Kingdom decided to leave Europe. The United Kingdom's always considered itself to be outside of the framework of what Europe is, but in a larger sense, leaving the European Union. And when you take a look at the voting patterns from a map, what do we notice here? We notice that there's a couple of areas in particular that are making this trend occur. London is right around here. There are a couple of other big cities. There's Liverpool. There's Birmingham down here. But generally, this is something that's rural versus urban. Urban people are voting to stay within the European Union. Rural people are voting to leave. We saw this in Italian elections in 2022, where essentially rural people are voting in one way, typically for center-right candidates, ones that would be considered kind of light Republicans in the United States. But urban people were voting typically for left-leaning candidates instead. We also see this in India, where this trend is continuing today with the BJP, the party that's considered to be Hindu nationalist, ruling over much of the Indian countryside, but other parties that are more left-leaning are typically concentrated in the cities, like Delhi, right over here. You've probably seen maps in 2020 and 2024 as far as elections by county. These are something similar that you would experience in the United States as well. All throughout the world, then, people are voting in different ways, not so much based on ethnicity, not so much based on culture, but more based on rural versus urban, this primary bifurcation that continues to exist in so many different places today. And today, the general thoughts about globalization as far as whether or not it's a benefit to people has changed. 10, 15 years ago, I think most people in the United States were significantly more in favor of globalization than they are today. Today, people are much more commonly thought of as seeing trade as being something particularly dangerous, as far as people from the outside as being cautionary. And this is something new, but it's not at all just about the United States. The largest wall today, if we think about walls being put up in the United States, this is something that's happening all over the world. The largest wall, as far as one that's bordered, as far as one that's got mines in it, is in the Sahara, in between the Western Sahara and portions controlled by Morocco. This is something that's been built since 2015. An example as far as the way Europe has changed significantly since then. Many countries since then, such as Hungary, such as Poland, have been putting up border walls in ways that they had not 10, 15 years ago. So what's changed? I don't know. I don't know what any of this really means. Some of it is about this, but some of it is also that the way that we consume our media is different now than it used to be. This is common not only for the generations that you are and that for I am, but that for many in general. We see this not only with what's going on with ourselves, but also with our leader. Each one of these dots is a tweet, and you can see that Donald Trump is by far the most prolific political tweeter that's achieved the presidency of any that have been before this time. So how does one define culture? How does one define when we say that there's a cultural division with red and blue? One of the problems is that culture is very difficult to define. And any of my cultural geography students know that I haven't done it yet, and spoiler alert, I'm not gonna. Sometimes it's language. When we think about the way Europe sees culture, many times it's a linguistic difference. And you can see that sometimes borders look the way that they do linguistically. Sometimes they don't, though. You can see in Romania, this country right down here. Can't see it very well, but there's Romania right there. There's a big block of Hungarian voters there. And if you know anything about Romanian history, it was those Hungarian voters that ended up deposing Nicolae Ceausescu, the dictator of Romania in the 80s. Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. The Balkans don't particularly see culture as being something linguistic. Sometimes it's religion. Any soccer fans? This is a picture of Ibrox Stadium in Glasgow. There's two big teams in Glasgow. One is Celtic and one is Rangers. The team that's to the left are Celtic. The team that are to the right are Rangers. And these primarily are ones that are thinking as far as what they are culturally based on religion. The side to the left are Catholic. The side to the right are Protestant. These are two teams that share the same stadium. Imagine the White Sox and the Cubs played in the same baseball stadium. And when they play each other, things get a little bit unusual. You can see that both sides don't particularly like each other to the point that they have to have police separating them in the process. This is the way that they view culture. In the Balkans, essentially the people that live in former Yugoslavia, Croatia on the far upper left, Bosnia in the middle, and Serbia a little bit further into the middle, all essentially speak the same language. The languages are more or less mutually intelligible. But the way that they think about culture is based on religion. If you're Catholic, you're thinking of yourself primarily as Croatian. If you're Muslim, you're primarily thinking of yourself as Bosnian. If you're Orthodox, you're thinking about yourself as Serb. And sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it truly does come down to rural versus urban. Once more, this is how Hungary views itself, rural and urban. If you know about Hungary today, you know about Viktor Orban, the leader who's particularly authoritarian, and he's gaining most of his form of power from rural parts of Hungary today. It's in the cities that this is not happening. So let's talk about rural geography and urban geography separately. For most of human history, from the time that we became agrarianists, up until about, 150 years ago, just about everybody lived in the countryside. Just about everybody lived in ways that were associated with farming. It wasn't until the Civil War in the United States that more than 50% of Americans made their livelihood in ways other than farming. Anybody know what the percentage of people that make their livelihood based on farming is today? It's about 1 to 1.5%. So today, that 1% of people are making food for the 99% of everybody else. And this is typically how things go in developed economies. What you can see after that 1900 shift is everybody's moving to urban areas. There were cities before the 1900s, but they were relatively much smaller. Consider that in the year 1000 AD, the largest city in the world was Cordoba, the capital of Spain. Today, this is about what the population of Naperville and Aurora are put together. Not a very large city. This is a fun map. This is one of my favorites. Anybody know what this is a map of? What's in the green here? Julia, what do you think?
If I had to guess, I want to say the white is like urban areas, and then the greenish bluish is like places where like no one lives, like rural areas.
I think you're like right there. Yes, it's close to this. So I think you. It's kind of like it. Should I just tell you? Are you not into guessing games today? The green is areas where nobody lives. So all of the green areas are census tracts where the population is 0. Nobody lives there. So when I say nobody lives there, I mean 0 people live there. The United States, especially west of the Mississippi, has a lot of space available to it. And yet everybody's crowded into the same spots. Here's Australia. 50% of the people that live in Australia live in the red. You might not even be able to see that from where you're at, right? We're talking about teeny tiny areas. Most of Australia is uninhabited. But the same is true in many countries. Here's Russia. When I lived in Russia, I could tell you that there are places where there are far more bears than people. To this point, Russia is so deprived of people, this is even before the war, in which case it's really become drastic, that if you wanted to move to Russia, they'd give you free land to do it. What's the catch? The catch is they're doing it because they can't sell it, and the reason they can't sell it is that nobody wants to live out in the middle of nowhere. This is not just about Russia, or it's not just about the United States. In Japan, where this is really deleterious, there are whole villages completely without people. One woman in particular who goes to a village to see her grandfather, one of the few people that lives here, has decided to start making dolls to make it appear that there's people still living in rural Japan. This is how deprived of people this area is. In a way, this almost looks like something out of a horror movie, doesn't it? Just go someplace and everybody's been replaced by dolls. Each one of these dolls used to be a person living in Japan. All those people are gone. This is something that will potentially happen in the United States as well. This is a population pyramid in Japan. And in Japan, their net fertility is 1.2, which means on average, they're having 1.2 children per woman. If you want a population to sustain itself, you need about 2 to 2.1 for this to occur. So in general, every generation, the population of Japan is about having. If there's 100 people, the next generation there will be 60. The next generation after that, there will be 36. So in the span of about 50 years, you're going to see the population of Japan decrease by about 2/3. In the United States, one of the ways that we get around this is through immigration, but it's very, very difficult to become a legal immigrant in Japan. Where are all of the Japanese people then? They're all in the big cities. This is obviously not where Tokyo is, but just to point out how big Tokyo is, it's about 36 million people big. It's about the size of Ireland. So it is a huge metropolitan area, the largest in the world today. This is what it looks like globally to talk about where there's no people. There are whole big areas where there's no one at all. Even in Illinois, an area that we have a pretty big chunk of people, I want to say what, 13 million people, something like that. This is a breakdown of what Illinois looks like. There are whole big areas of Illinois that if you travel far out enough, it becomes very, very empty very fast. Some of this is because this is where the money's at. If you want to talk about where you can make a higher standard of living, people go to cities because cities are primarily labor markets. If you have a job that has like a certain degree of skill, if you have a job that you have to get a high degree for, there's a pretty good chance that you're only going to find work for them in bigger cities, sometimes even in very big cities. As a result, large portions of Illinois are significantly poorer than you would find anywhere around here. This is often a surprise to people when they think about where tax dollars go in Illinois. In general, the suburbs, the areas that we're in right now, tend to overpay our taxes, and those tax dollars tend to go into rural areas. That's not to say that things are good, because everywhere in red in this is not a red versus blue map. All the counties in red are areas that people are leaving. These are areas where the population is decreasing. it would be difficult for me to talk in general about these because rural life in the Great Plains is different than rural life in Appalachia, which is different than rural life in the American Southwest. So I'm just going to pick one area that's a little bit closer to home to talk about in particular. It happens to be an area that I know a little bit more about than other places, Alexander County, Illinois. So it's the dark red right there. Anybody know anything about Cairo, Illinois? First off, it's pronounced Cairo. It's not Cairo. It looks like Cairo. In the 19th century, there was a whole big set of different cities that were founded that they changed the name's pronunciation. In Illinois, you can find a Vienna, Illinois. Looks like Vienna. You can find a Palestine, Illinois. Looks like Palestine. You can find a whole bunch of little towns like this that were founded in the 19th century. There's a Morocco, Indiana. This is what the town looked like in 1885. And Cairo had a number of significant geographic advantages to it. It was surrounded by two of the largest rivers anywhere in North America and two of the most important. On the east, you can see the Ohio River. On the west, you can see the Mississippi River. Where two rivers converge, typically this is something that's a tremendous benefit. You would see a large city there. That's why St. Louis is where it is, for example. It's where the Mississippi River meets the Missouri River. Yet this hasn't been the fate of Cairo. This is the population of Alexander County throughout the years. This is where you can find it. And one thing you notice is that it starts out very small. It seems like it peaks in about 1930 at about 23,000 people, half the population of Orland Park. And today, it's got 4,800. My understanding is it's truly in free fall. It's probably about 3,000 today in 2026. In the 1910s, 1920s, people sent postcards all over the place. This was something that was much more common than it is today. If you go on vacation, you'll still send one. But they used to send postcards for things that were not even about going on vacation. This is what Cairo looked like in about the 1910s based on a postcard. And this is what it looks like today. This is the Gem Theater, a historic theater that's in downtown Cairo. This is what it looks like inside. Cairo had its own hospital until the 1980s, the Southern Medical Center. Definitely small by suburban hospital standards, but it's been out of use since the 1980s. Cairo had significant ethnic and cultural tensions in it. This is a protest in front of the fire station in the 1960s. This is it today. This is a picture on 7th Street, an area that's essentially downtown. What do you think it's like growing up in a town like this, where you're reminded all over the place that things used to be better than they are today, where each one of these buildings had people, each one of these buildings had shops, they had entertainment, they had culture, and all that's gone. You can imagine that when you hear somebody saying that they want to revive what America used to be, that resonates in a different way than maybe it does in an urban area where there's a sense of constant renewal. One of the reasons that I like to go down there is for this barbecue restaurant. It's got really good beef brisket. That's my hand. But that's neither here nor there. Cairo is surrounded by a levee. Because it's surrounded by two very large and fickle rivers, if the rivers ever got too high, what they could do is they could close that right there and the city becomes an island, almost like a fortress. If you're interested in Cairo, I've got pretty good news for you. It's pretty cheap to buy a house there. To the left, I was just looking through what it costs to get a place to live in the Bay Area, in San Francisco. And you can find yourself a shed for $800 a month. That's it. That's the shed. You have kind of a curtain that you can pull over for a bathroom, but it's probably about the size of maybe these two put together, maybe a little bit larger than that for $800 a month. Or you could buy a house for $19,000 cash. That's about what, $127 a month? If you have a car payment, it's probably less, or it's probably more than that, right? So why aren't people living someplace where it's so ridiculously cheap to live? Well, because typically when people move somewhere, they want to have some place they can work. They want to have proximity to things like stores, like grocery stores, places like that. And in Cairo, there's really not much there for them. I want to suggest this to you once more, that this is common in the United States. We tend to think about areas where the population is increasing. Each one of these counties in red is decreasing. And rural America is generally just, in lots of places, fading out of existence. You'll see that most of these counties that have lost more than 10% of the population are voting in one particular way, one way that speaks to the idea that America is resurrectable, the idea that when they see around them that America is in decline, that this is something that can be changed and reversed back. Why is all this happening? Why is rural America declining so fast? Goes without saying, I don't have the answers, but I do have some ideas. This is a trend line for corn production in the United States. You'll take a look at this and you'll say, wow, it looks like that looks pretty standard until 1930s, and then it really starts taking off after this. This is where farms began to become mechanized. So where tractors became common, things like that. And if you just happen to look, that also tends to be exactly when the population falls through the floor. So these are largely displaced farm workers that never went back. Adding to this is the idea that this is also when farm sizes began to increase. In the 1930s, if you were able to get something like a tractor that were able to make agricultural work so much more productive, then you didn't hire workers, and those workers went elsewhere, mostly into cities. This is so much more than just something like a presidential election. Some of it is cultural as well. One particular AIDS researcher, I want to say his name was Abraham Genovese, but don't quote me on this, in 1985 noticed that in his work at a clinic in rural Appalachia, he noticed that these were where he would find patients that were essentially dying from AIDS. But where did they acquire it? They acquired it from places that were outside of rural Appalachia. Oftentimes, when you have areas that are very small, that are outside of large cities, the culture can become very oppressive, especially for people that are seen as outside of the mainstream. People that wanted to find their way in, people that wanted to find like-minded people would often go to big cities because they couldn't find their way home in general. They acquired them in big cities because that's where they could find like-minded individuals, but then they went home to die. Even today, it can be very, very difficult for people that are not heteronormative to find like-minded individuals outside of big cities. This is true for cultures, for languages, for religions, for all sorts of things. Oftentimes, rural environments can be much more common as far as only one group to the exclusion of others. Okay, let's talk about urban geography next. This is related to that one map that I showed you before. Anybody know what this is a map of? Yes, it's very related to population density. 50% of Americans live in the blue. The other 50% live in the gray. If we took a look at this as far as economics, then we see the same thing. 50% of the population is basing its economics in both the orange and in the yellow. The orange and the yellow make up 50% of the economic activity of the United States. Then comes the light blue next, and this rest of it, this dark blue, that is 1/4 of the total economic output of the United States. While rural environments have shrunk, it is really in the urban environments where we see population increasing. This has been the way that it has for almost ever since the founding of the United States. We started out with a very small urban population, and it's continued to increase over time. This is true globally. This is not just something that's occurring in the United States. I'm not sure if I like this kind of map. This is called a choropleth map. This is a map that does gradations of color to show an increase. And I think in some ways this is good, but in some ways it makes it really hard to read. Like, which are the areas around the United States and around the world today that are predominantly rural or predominantly urban? Maybe this one is better for that. So the countries that are in the kind of cyan color, those are ones that are still predominantly rural, and the others are predominantly urban. This was something that I just kind of popped out really fast. This is based on total economic output as far as a country, GDP per capita, and percent urbanized. The more urbanized a country is, the wealthier it tends to be. This is a correlation, this isn't a causality, but in general, if you take a look at countries that are very urban, they tend to be wealthier than countries that are not urban. Even in the areas that this is not true for, one of the biggest groupings of countries that you see here is in sub-Saharan Africa. This is changing very, very rapidly. The urbanizing patterns that are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa are occurring very, very rapidly. It's probably going to be in the next 5 to 10 years that Africa is also predominantly an urban area, which is going to leave very few places around the world as being primarily rural. Cities have always been different. They've always been culturally different. They've always been economically different. They've always had advantages in ways that others have not. In Europe, for example, big portions of the medieval era and the Renaissance area had free cities. These were cities that were sort of outside of the realm of law of the kingdom itself. Kings could enforce authority in rural areas, but cities pretty much did what they wanted to. This was true for serfdom as well. This is something that was commonly said in German cities, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes one free. Breathing city air means that you are no longer a part of serfdom. You can see how appealing this would be if you were a form of bonded labor. This is a picture of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. And it was technically unified, but in reality, it was a whole bunch of little cities that were kind of like Frankenstein together to make this empire that really wasn't much of an area at all. Most of these cities were independent, they did their own thing, and they did so against the whims of larger areas. You can understand that if you were a king, if you were somebody that had large tracts of land outside of a city, you might very well resent these cities. These were areas that you could not control. There's a great story from Herodotus in ancient Greece about this, about a leader named Anacharsis, who was a leader of the Scythians. And he loved being in cities so much. He was a nomad. He would go there. He would dress like somebody that lived in Olbia, the city over here in ancient Greece. When his people found him out, they executed him. So this rural-urban divide, even then, was so strong. In the United States, city areas are different than rural areas in a lot of ways. This is, again, a trend line map. You can see that there's just more residuals in this case. You've got areas like Vermont and Maine that are not particularly urban, but that are wealthier. You've got areas like, say, for example, Nevada, that is very urban, but not quite as wealthy. But in general, this holds true as well. In general, people that live in cities tend to have more educational background. One of the reasons why, if you haven't discovered it, is if you are going to have a job that requires you to have a degree, oftentimes the labor markets that you might be looking for are not in rural areas. There are exceptions, but there are a lot of places that will be very hard for you to find a line of work that's concurrent with your education experience in rural areas. They also tend to be wealthier. Some of the wealthiest areas in the United States, this map is old, but newer ones don't change it that much. The wealthier areas of the state tend to be around urban areas. Thinking more broadly, this is where you can find SNAP enrollment, and you see that primarily we're talking about areas in particular in rural spots in the United States. Once more, this picture reminding us that when it comes to overall wealth patterns in the United States, big cities have significantly higher levels of wealth than oftentimes rural areas do. You can probably think about times that the red versus blue cultural divide has been seen by you. I don't know about you, but oftentimes if you talk to, say, like a family member who lives outside of the area and you bring up Chicago, they will often talk about how dangerous Chicago is or how crime-ridden it is. In reality, the most crime-ridden areas in the United States are typically areas that are completely outside of big cities. Depending on where you put them, the most crime-ridden areas in the United States are typically ones you have never heard of and that I've never heard of either. But big cities have more people, and so they get more news media coverage. So people typically that are in rural areas tend to view people that are in urban areas with some degree of suspicion or fear. The opposite is true as well, though. There are many people that are living in rural areas that when they go to when they live in urban areas, they go to rural areas, they'll find that rural areas are also places of danger as well. Many of you probably know the story of Emmett Till, for example. A boy that came from Chicago went to rural Mississippi where he was murdered because he was seen as being somebody that was outside of who should be there. Sundown towns are one particular aspect of this. Another book, if you're thinking of something interesting to read, is the concept of the sundown town. These are towns that urban people, especially people of color, were not allowed to be in after the sun went down. If they were, bad things would happen to them. Many times these are things that are not found on a map. You will not find them written down anywhere, but they exist. Some of them continue to exist today. So rural areas and urban areas see each other differently. They tend to say that, for example, if you talk to people that are living in central or southern Illinois, oftentimes they'll say that the politicians that Chicago elects are not people that are keen to their values. Sometimes in different countries, this gets to be excessively violent. Pol Pot and the Killing Fields, for example, was essentially about Pol Pot's hatred of people that lived in urban areas. And most of the genocide that occurred in Cambodia occurred based on urban dwellers. So let's talk about the differing problems that rural America has and urban America has. In a lot of ways, these are ones based around the concept of perspective. It can be difficult to talk about what makes rural and what makes urban. And different geographers will have different perspectives on what it means to be urban and what it means to be rural. Peoria, Illinois, for example, most people would say would be urban, but what about its exurbs? What about the suburbs of the suburbs in Peoria? Are those rural or are those urban? This can be challenging. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to pose a couple of just hypothetical ideas to you to talk about just how these two groups oftentimes have difficulty seeing eye to eye on concepts. Urban dwellers are much more commonly placed in apartments than they are in homes. In high-core urban environments, I believe the number is 54% of people are homeowners. That means 46% are not. In Rural areas, it's typically 76 to 78% of people that are living in homes as opposed to renting. This means that home ownership is dramatically different. It's dramatically higher in rural areas than urban areas. If any of you ever lived in an apartment, one of the things that you know about this is you find that it's really helpful to have neighbors that you can have good dialogues with. What if the person that lives under you or above you likes to play noise likes to play music at 2 or 3 a.m.? What's that going to do for you if you have work at 6 in the morning? This is something that's going to be a problem for you if you live in an apartment. If you live out in the sticks and if you own your own home, this might not be as much of an issue to you. What this means also, what if the person above you has a sink leaking and the water is coming through the floor into your place? What they do directly affects you in a way that if you own your own home separate from other people, it may not. These are some of the sorts of things that make urban living just so much culturally different than rural areas are. So this is a map of home ownership. It's a little bit messy, but if you look at it kind of closely, you can tell that rural areas do tend to have kind of the darker colors, and urban areas tend to have the lighter ones, showing that home ownership rates are typically lower in urban areas than in rural areas. Another thought. Anybody that's ever taken public transportation in the United States knows that it is overwhelmingly an urban idea. Around here, it can be really challenging to get to a bus. It can be done, but what if you lived in rural America? Public transportation makes much more sense if you're talking about high density areas where there's a lot of people. You can make the bills pay themselves if that's the case. If you've been on a bus or been on a subway, you know that what the people do immediately around you directly affects you. If somebody's playing music loud, we've all been next to the person at a restaurant that is talking into their phone and is driving us crazy. This is not something that might happen if you're out in the middle of nowhere where there's nobody else around. Think about car ownership in rural areas versus urban areas. Again, car ownership can be almost mandatory around here. In urban areas, it's not. My mother-in-law, for example, hasn't had a car in 50 years? She lives in the city, and she's totally fine without one. Another one is gun ownership. What do we notice about these two maps side by side? The right one is population density. There is no, as far as I know, list of gun ownership per county. So this is about as good as I could do. This is an AirSots one. This is gun dealers by county. These are people that are actually monitored. What do we notice about these two maps?
They're nearly inverse of each other.
Yes, they're almost inverse. So the more gun dealers there are, typically the smaller the population density is of that area. And why do you think that is? Why do you think that gun ownership is probably more common in rural areas than it is in urban areas per capita? It could be for hunting. It could also be for the fact that in many urban spots, if you have a dilemma, police are probably going to be pretty close by. If it comes to, say, western Montana, if you have an issue, police might be very, very, very far away. Maybe. A lot of this comes down to, this is another great book idea if you're thinking of one, Arnold Kling's 3 Languages of Politics. What Arnold Kling suspects, and what he's written a book on, is the idea that to some degree, red, blue, and libertarian, that interesting mix of both that's not really either one, are speaking 3 different languages about the dilemmas that they see. People that are left-wing tend to view the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed. They tend to view cultural problems as far as there are people that are oppressing others, and there are people that are oppressed, and this is the way through which they see things. Conservatives, on the whole, tend to view things from civilization versus barbarism or civilization versus chaos. This is the lens through which they see many of the social ills that are around. And then libertarians tend to view things as far as oppressor and oppressed. there are people that are oppressing others, and there are people that are doing the oppressing. Think about, say, for example, some of the big cultural problems in the United States for today. Case in point, some of what's been going on with immigration reform and immigration detention. Conservatives will view this as far as the issue about law. They will say, if you're breaking the law and if you're not held responsible for that, this is a breakdown of social order. This is chaos. Laws need to be enforced because this is how civilization performs. Yet liberals will typically see this in a very different way. They will say, these are people that are not so much breaking laws because these are civil infractions. This is about one group of people that is oppressing another one. Neither one of which holds the complete truth. But both of them will have difficulty finding common ground on this because they're speaking in different linguistic forms. Many times people that believe that laws need to be enforced are done in rural areas. These are ones for which these are things that they see on the news and not in day-to-day life. People that are living in urban areas might think of it differently because these are people that are seeing these things happen to them directly. Another one is COVID. You lived through it as well as I did, and you remember what that was like. The terror, the difficulty, the finding of that people that you knew were sick. Yet, it was a very different experience in rural areas than it was in urban areas. In urban areas, to this day, there were whole villages, communities, municipalities that COVID touched very lightly. These were people that said that mandating that everybody could not go to work, that there was a national shutdown order, was particularly oppressive because this was not something that affected them. Yet in urban areas where everybody probably by 2020 knew of people that were getting sick and many people knew people that had died, it was something very different. This was something about sheer survival. One area is saying, what about our livelihoods? The other one is saying, what about our lives? And if you've been without a livelihood for a long enough time, you know that eventually the two start becoming very, very difficult to separate from each other. Another common discussion point is about English as an official language. Kevin, is English an official? I remember there was talk about it becoming one. I know that was like an executive order. English today is not our official language. The United States has no official language. Yet, when it comes to people that speak more than one language, again, this map is definitely messy. You can see the American Southwest, long kind of a cultural milieu of the Southwest United States and the northern portion of Mexico, fusing to be kind of a common culture. We see that there are many spots around the United States in rural areas where speaking a language other than English is extremely uncommon. So you can understand the appeal if nobody around you speaks any language other than English, and if nobody they know speaks a language other than English. Where in urban areas, typically this is somewhat seen as being a way of making people that are American feel othered if they speak a different language. Many spots around the world, too, people that were seen as outside of the mainstream had specific harbors within urban areas. This is a picture of where the Dutch lived in Nagasaki, for example, which was one of the Japanese major cities. When we think about different cultural communities, oftentimes they were only able to incorporate themselves into cities and not into the rural areas around them. I say this, but there's some history going the opposite way as well. If you go into even Will County, even portions of Cook County, look around the cemeteries that are old, you'll find plenty of German headstones around here. You will find lots of people that used to speak different languages that have been incorporated into the American mainstream. Another way that red and blue separate themselves is sometimes with economic policy. In the state of Illinois right now, the minimum wage is $15 an hour, which buys a heck of a lot more in rural portions of the state than it does in urban areas of the state. These are average weekly wages. So this is the median weekly wages someone's going to be earning. You can see that when you've got a county like, for example, Alexander County, where Cairo is today, that the average earner is earning slightly above minimum wage, which means that in general, talking about a change in the minimum wage is going to affect a significant number of people. In economics, typically we say that because labor demand is downward sloping, the higher it costs to hire somebody, the fewer people will be hired. You can understand then that unemployment rates are typically significantly higher in the southern portion of the state than in the northern, where the minimum wage laws are nowhere near as tight as they are in places in the southern half. To some extent, conservatives, red portions of our country, tend to view education with more suspicion. You've definitely seen universities, you've seen colleges, you've seen them come under more scrutiny than other places around. And maybe one of the reasons for that is that education is something that, again, as far as higher education, tends to be something that's found more in in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. You can see a couple of spots that are outside of this. You can see Champaign County, which is right. Clicker's not working, right there. And McLean County, so you can see where ISU is on this map, and you can see where U of I is on this map. These are areas that, whatever I think, whatever you think, there are people that are just as smart, just as knowledgeable, just as wise as you, and maybe just based on where they live at and what their experiences were, have differing opinions. Where do the suburbs fit in here? The suburbs are truly where things are changing. In the United States, about 85% of our population is urban. About 15% of it is rural. If this was the only bifurcation that existed, every national politician in the whole country would be a blue person, right? Because they would make up 85% of the vote. There are two things that affect this. The first one is there is no county anywhere in the United States where more than about 80% of people vote one way. You will find people that vote Democratic in the most red counties in the United States. You will find people that vote blue in the opposite as well. But the other one is that the suburbs are an interesting mix in this. Where do they fit into this? When thinking about this, it's important to note that so much of the United States' more recent city builds are much more suburban than they are urban. This is where you could find Paris today. It's about 2.5 million people. And the area around that, that's about the size of Houston. About the same population, but you can see that Houston is significantly more low density. Houston, if anybody ever been to Houston? What did it feel like?
A lot of roads.
Yeah, to me, it doesn't have a very good public transportation system. It felt like just one big suburb to me once you leave the city center. It felt like just strip mall after strip mall after strip mall after big road after big road. And this tends to be how the more recent cities in the United States that are developing are coming to be. The largest city in the United States right now, the largest city in Florida today, anybody know what it is? Biggest city in Florida? It's Jacksonville. It's not Miami, it's not Tampa, it's Jacksonville. And one of the reasons that it's Jacksonville is that Jacksonville is literally the entire county that it's in. It's just the whole county is just one big low density area. Ooh, did not mean to put those in there. Sorry, I thought I took that out. Why are suburbs so common in the United States? One of the reasons that they're so big is suburbanization is immediately pulled with the advent of the car. There were suburbs beforehand, but many of those suburbs eventually got integrated into the bigger cities around them. Hyde Park, for example, the community in Chicago, used to be a suburb. And when the railroad tracks went out far enough, they decided they wanted to be on their water system, and so they got hooked into being in Chicago. Suburbs, though, were a little bit further out, and they were largely things that were only able to be gotten to by car. There are a couple of different countries that have suburbs like the United States do, but there's not that many of them. We do, Canada does, Australia does, to some extent South Africa does, and one of the more recent ones is the United Arab Emirates in Dubai. And we'll talk a little bit about how these work. This is kind of a complicated one. It can be a little bit challenging to show. There's a lot of information in here, but essentially this says, how do people get to and from their jobs? And you can see that the blue areas around here are uniquely North American. Just about everybody in just about every metropolitan area is getting there by car. Even in the most densely urbanized areas in the United States, people commute by car significantly more than they do in other spots around. Any questions on this? I know this one's kind of a weird one. What makes suburbs so different? Suburbs are truly where the dividing lines between red and blue seem like they hit. These are areas that over time, different townships will go bluer, different townships will go redder, but in general, many swing states in particular, it's in the suburbs of these swing states where things really truly change. Illinois is not a swing state by any stretch of the imagination, but you can see just how much more blue Illinois has gotten over time. Suburbs in the United States really took off after World War I, and there were two big reasons why. One of which we've already talked about, which is the car, but there's another one that's a little bit more obscured. Following World War I and the Great Depression, there were a number of American veterans who were called the bonus army. They wanted money that they were supposed to get from their World War I service during the height of the Great Depression when they didn't have any money. The United States chose to give them concessions, but not necessarily in the way that they thought they would. Let me give you another example of civil turmoil. This was in 1987, I think? I always try to remember it based on the Taylor Swift. 89, that's right, it was TS 1989. Okay, so it was 1989. And people that are around my age remember seeing this on TV, the idea of tanks rolling in and a lone dissident standing in front of the tanks to stop it. Yet this never happened again in China. Even though China is as repressive as it ever was, it's as authoritarian as it ever was. What happened that made China so disinterested in democracy? Why is it that this never happened again? Home ownership. What both the United States and China did after their significant periods of civil unrest was they decided they needed to make home ownership a much bigger portion of citizenship. Both of them came to the same conclusion. People that own homes are significantly less likely to cause civil strife. They're significantly less likely to rebel. They're significantly less likely to be rioting in the streets. Even think about today where you see significant civil unrest. There's a reason that oftentimes it's in urban areas where home ownership is so much less significant. Following World War II, when they had some money and they wanted to make sure that this didn't happen again, this was when the advent of American suburbanization began to occur. First in Levittown, New Jersey, but then spreading throughout the country. What's interesting is this same pattern is occurring in Dubai. This next picture that I'm going to show you, it's almost hypnotic. This is what suburbs look like in Dubai. It almost looks AI generated, doesn't it? But it's not. This is the way that suburbs are being created in Dubai. You may also note that this is how Saudi Arabia is building them as well in that city. What is it called? Nami, I think it is. It's the long city that they're building with the oil money that is depleting in Saudi Arabia? Well, if everybody had a home, that would mean that civil strife would be significantly less, right? One of the problems is that this is contingent based on two ideas: car ownership and home ownership. Cars are becoming significantly more costly over time. I was thinking about this the other day, and I couldn't help but wonder if probably all of you have seen e-bikes and e-scooters, wondering if this is truly the future of transportation for people. E-bikes, they're cheap, they're pretty quick, you don't need insurance for them, you don't need a driver's license for them. And I think about when I was 16, 17, how you basically had to get a job to pay for the car that you needed to get to your job. And today, what if things like e-transportation is going to break that chain? I don't know. But the other one is, and you probably know this as well as I do, home ownership has become much, much, much more expensive than it used to be. Maybe this will change, but I'm not 100% sure. And believe it or not, that was 155 slides. I know it didn't seem like we were going to have time for questions, but
Yeah, we have 15 more minutes. Thank you, Professor King, for your presentation. We have 15 more minutes for questions and comments. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and I'll come around and get to you. And maybe to start us off, the rural versus urban divide that you showed for the United States, can you talk a little bit about the political implications that that would have, thinking like in terms of control for the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College, that if more and more Democrats are kind of disproportionately in cities and Republicans are disproportionately in rural areas, what might the consequences be for control of the political institutions?
very good question. One of the things that I often hear political scientists and theorists talk about is the decline of purple America. Purple America being this portion that in some ways is a mixture of red and blue, that in general politicians are more bifurcated today than they have been before. There were even some politicians in this area that were, I think they were called, Blue Dog Democrats. Lipinski was one. These were ones that held conservative social values but tended to vote Democratic. These ones are much more rare. As people leave rural areas and go to other parts of the country, a lot of times they'll go to areas where the taxes are lower, which is one reason that Illinois has been typically losing seats, and why areas like Florida, which is lower cost area, tends to gain seats. There's a downside to this, and that's that Illinois has a higher cost of living relative to other spots, but Florida has lower wages. So typically, the people that I've heard that are moving to Florida tend to find that yes, the housing is cheaper, yes, these other things are happening, but the wages people are also earning are significantly lower. So my hunch is this process is going to exacerbate, where we're going to see states like Texas, like Florida, continue to gain seats, and we might very well see Illinois lose seats. In areas where it's a win or lose everything, this can be pretty dramatic. Does that answer? I'm not sure if I really answered the question.
I think you hit on one dynamic. I think another dynamic I was thinking about is just how Republicans might represent, or they have represented, fewer people for the better part of 2 decades in the U.S. Senate. If you're looking at the 2 senators from each state and the states that are red versus the 2 states that are blue, whereas Democrats are representing more of a majority of the population, but they have a minority of the seats in the Senate. And the way that impacts the Electoral College, where we've had a couple of elections where the Democratic candidate gets a higher percentage of the popular vote, but loses the Electoral College because they're losing some of these rural states like a Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota, and so forth.
I don't know if I've told you all this before, but like Wyoming, for example, is 300,000 people. Do you know how many escalators Wyoming has in it? The whole state? Phoebe, you might remember this. Two. It has 2 escalators in the whole state. Just one of those weird geographic bits of trivia that I think of. And yet those 300,000 people have 2 senators, and so does a state like California or Illinois, Illinois having 13 million people. So representation is definitely skewed. Ah, the classic American view of compromise, right? Any other questions?
I was going to say, do you think politically, when it comes to Democrats and Republicans representing more urban and the rural kind of split, do you think it will? Oh, sorry. Thank you. Do you think that Democrats and Republicans will go further for their bases in urban or rural areas, or do you think this divide can be met with that compromise as you met? Or do you think it's dying out because of how the split is very much growing because of the population that they serve specifically?
That's a really good question. I have a couple of thoughts on this one. Up until about, say, 2016 or so, there was this idea in political science called Hoteling's law. That was this idea that when you have only 2 candidates and you have this broad spectrum of voters, you've got people on the far left that are super duper ultra mega far left, you got people on the super duper ultra mega far right, and you have only 2 candidates. If you want to maximize the number of people you can potentially get in your elections, what are you going to do as a candidate? And the answer was go towards the center, because people on the far left are going to have no other real choice but besides vote for you. The people on the far right, if you're that one on the other side. Do you remember the Rage Against the Machine music video with Gush and Bohr in the 2000s? It was essentially showing that Bush and Gore in the 2000 election, they were saying the exact same thing. I don't know if this is true anymore, because I feel like in 2016 and 2020 and 2024, that very few people would say Kamala Harris and Donald Trump were saying the same things. I believe that what their intention was, to some extent, was to get more people to vote. Yes, it is possible that people on the far left are going to vote for the center candidate because they have to, but it's also possible they're not going to vote, and that's also the third option. I don't know. To some extent, I feel like there are a lot of issues that Americans in the center hold very strongly, and both parties are viewing it in very different ways. I don't know that people talk about Hoteling's law in the same way that they did with the reverence for it that they did 10, 15 years ago. I don't know. And I hate to say that, but at the same time, one of the great things about being a teacher for 20 years is I can say I don't know, and I'm totally comfortable with saying I don't know. When I was new, I would have felt like they're going to realize I'm a fraud. But now, it just doesn't matter. Troy.
So I have a question. It's interesting to see the map of like the red and the blue, right, and the breakdown of the parties. But I always really try to view our parties as coalitions of groups coming together to fight, right? Where like in Europe, you may have a bunch of little parties. In the US, we have 2 big parties with a bunch of groups within those parties. So within the Democratic Party, you may have environmentalists, and you may have labor, and you may have civil rights activists, and on the Republicans, you may have big business and libertarians and different groups that aren't always aligned with each other.
No.
And it seems as if, and this, I'd love to hear you hit on like big ideas. What are the things that have shifted where you'd have, to me it seems like there's an argument to be made that the purple destruction, where there's less purple areas, is because those subgroups have aligned themselves geographically and economically away from each other, which then leads to some of those conversations. And maybe, I'd be curious to hear, number one, do you think if that's true, and what are the factors that push that alignment, right? Like, why are all the Democrats ending up in urban areas, which hasn't always been true, and the Republicans ending up in the rural areas? And I know you just touched on a whole lot of it, but it seems like thinking coalitionally about it, how would you explain that, or can you? You can say, I don't know, it's okay.
Well, let me preface this by saying I don't know. But if I had to suggest one thing, I would say that one big change would be kind of the demographic position of the United States. Until fairly recently, Americans in general had way more kids than other countries in the developing world do. And we still do. But net fertility in the United States right now is about 1.7, which means that America is no longer able to sustain its population by just having kids. There's two ways that we could deal with this. One way is that we can have more immigrants, which has traditionally been the way that the United States has dealt with this problem. The other one is by just accepting that we're going to have a population in decline. And the thing about a population in decline is this is something that we pay for down the road. I guess, you know what, could I go back about, I'm not going to go back about a jillion slides. Japan, for example, the 1980s. If you were, very few of you are old enough to remember the 1980s in the United States, there was this theory in the 1980s that Japan was going to overcome the United States, that we were going to become the number two. This is at a time when buying a Japanese car was seen as being anti-American. If you bought a Honda or, I don't know, a Toyota, you were seen as not being loyal to your country in doing so. Today, I don't think that this is traditionally a way that people view themselves as being patriotic or not. And they didn't pay for this idea that they didn't have enough kids and they didn't have enough immigrants until fairly recently when their GDP has been in free fall. So my guess is some of this occurs because the demographics of the United States are changing so rapidly. And some of the country says the way that we're going to deal with this is by increasing immigration. And another part of it says, we don't know what the solution is, but we're not sure about this. And unfortunately, xenophobia has been a big part of American history ever since its founding for a very long time. I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you, Professor King. This is a very comprehensive presentation, 155 slides. Please join me in thanking Professor King.
Thank you, everybody.
Alex, our interpreter up front. So thank you very much too, Alex, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. Anybody has any questions that I didn't get to or, well, please feel free to drop me an email. Or I'll stick around now. Have a good day, everybody.